Okay. Hello, I'm Anthony Munson, and I am a freshman at Carroll High School. My topic is the death of the innocent joke. I'm going to start off talking about the first time I remember I was black. It was about a week ago or so. I know, I'm just kidding. But in all actuality, it was whenever I was in 3rd grade, and this was a time in my life in which I wore really high socks. I was known for being smart in my class, and I had an affinity for wearing my pants above my navel. Now, this kind of reminds you of someone along the lines of Steve Urkel, and indeed, it was very accurate. One time I remember, some student, we were discussing, I don't remember the exact time or place or all of the situations, but I remember the basic idea. And that was that after someone said that I was black, they refuted the statement saying, he's not black, he's white. So I looked down at my skin, I looked back in person, looked down at my skin, and was very confused. How am I not black? I said, well, you're white on the inside, you're like an Oreo. And this was very confusing to me because, to me, previously, my social identity as being black really hadn't had anything to do with my life. It was simply just part of my skin color, and that was it. And I really didn't understand the ramifications of it. But later on, I saw that the identities that are tied to and attributed to certain groups in society can have profound impacts on how people view you and how you interact in the world. So, you ask, what is identity? And without delving into the philosophies of Heidegger or Sartre, you ask who you are and who are you supposed to be. And often, there's great contrast between the two. What some people view as how we should be and how we actually are in our society can have great disparity between the two. And how we conceptualize the two can be very conflicting. I say that stereotypes and I have some talking to do. I kind of self-label myself as a nerd, and I think that there's oftentimes some distance between how we think of people and how they should be and how we actually are. This is who people think I am, whereas in all actuality, this is who I actually am. Now, although there may be some similarities, and sometimes where stereotypes may be true or have some accuracies, it's not always to be the case. Now, the conflict that occurs often has ramifications in a concept called identity contingencies. And identity contingencies are basically opportunities, restrictions, judgments, or other sorts of ramifications that one experiences in a specific sort of setting because of who they are and how they're perceived in a situation. Now, I give you an example. Let's say I'm at a party and there's a large, vast array of all sorts of fruits. They all look very delicious, and let's say that everybody's going to go get the watermelon. Now, African Americans who are stereotyped who have proclivity for watermelon, maybe everybody's going up, trying the watermelon, everybody says it sounds delicious, and I'm sitting in the back of the room, not really wanting to go get that watermelon because I don't want to really affirm what that stereotype entails. And because of how my social identity is labeled in that situation, I feel the ramifications of that there. So there are 3 basic types of identity contingencies, and it's a pretty basic system. You have positive identity contingencies, neutral, and negative. Now, positive identity contingencies are going to be ones that usually don't have too much effect on one and how they interact. They're ones that are seen to be generally good. Now, this will be African American skills, maybe basketball, or Asians' adeptness in mathematics or science. And yes, this is a picture of me. This was back in the day, true story. Neutral contingencies, on the other hand, which have a very similar pattern pattern as positive contingencies really don't affect us too much at all. This will be something such as someone from a certain sex having to go to a certain bathroom, or possibly you being a youth who wears jeans. That's part of maybe your social identity and how you're perceived, but it doesn't have too much effect on what you can do or how people look at you in society. Now, contrasting from this is something that is called negative contingencies. And these are going to be the stereotypes oftentimes that you are more familiar with, and many times the ones that create more conflict. Negative contingencies may be such as having bipolar disorder, not being able to act as freely because of fear, and oftentimes not even fear from previous situations, but just fear of something, some body being able to judge you because of what you think might happen. And maybe somebody doesn't act as though they normally would because they have apprehension of how other people will look at them. Another situation will be those caused by segregation. And this is very general, but I will look to a specific situation from the provost and professor of psychology at Columbia University. His name is Bottom Steele, and he's a pioneer in a field of social psychology, especially the ones I will detail later. And he recounts whenever the first time he remembered he was black. The first time he remembered he was black was back in the 1950s, where there was racial segregation given by the United States. And he remembers this because he was very excited about after the school year ended. He was about 7 or 8, and he wanted to go to a swimming pool and go there all summer. And at that time, his race, mostly because he was very young, didn't really have too much of an effect on his life. But he really began to see the ramifications after he was told that African Americans were only able to go to the swimming pools on Wednesdays. And this was very striking to him because now in his spatial awareness, in his interactions in the world, he saw that he had limitations he had not previously known. A similar situation happened with a white student who was in an African American political science class. And after the majority of the class, who was African American, talked about white people as they or the white people and referenced African Americans as we, he felt very distanced from them. And because of his social identity as being a white person, he felt that he was not able to engage in conversation as freely as he wanted to. And because in this context, he saw that he had these restrictions that were imposed by who he was there. Now, negative contingencies do have uniqueness from positive or neutral contingencies. And these are going to be certain factors. First of all, they're more psychologically preoccupying. Whenever people have positive contingencies or neutral contingencies, they don't tend to think about them all the time. It's not constantly on their mind, and they're not as consciously aware of how people are going to view them for having that social identity. It also leads to a greater realization of the identities. And I like to use an analogy about invisible ink and UV light. And this is basically that everybody, one way or another, has a lot of social identities, a vast tapestry by which people view you. And negative contingencies happen to be the UV light to all of the the invisible inks of all of your social identities, and they really shine through. You must only, as I stated earlier with the bipolar disorder, you only have to be possibly affected by it, have the awareness that you could be perceived in a certain way in order to have that threat imposed upon you. And lastly, you see that oftentimes that threat and feeling is caused by negative contingencies, as though we have personal threat to ourselves because of who we are in society. And this leads to one of the main points I'm trying to make in this talk. And that is one about stereotype and identity threat. And that's basically a subset of negative contingencies that one feels especially threatened to them. And this has vast ramifications in terms of performance. In the field of social psychology, especially over the last decade, we've seen great studies on this topic. With Claude Steele and other prominent social psychologists, it has been a very important, it has had a very important role in that field. And when we look towards the basis of that identity and stereotype threat, the initial studies that showed it were about certain minority groups who had shown lessened performance in certain fields. This was women in mathematical situations or African Americans in general academic settings. And what they did, they looked at Stanford, a very prestigious college in which most of the students had probably scored extremely high on the SATs. And they categorized these students looking with white students and black students, and students who had this natural stereotype threat imposed upon them, and ones who had this fear, this apprehension of being restricted by a negative stereotype of African Americans having lower intelligence. And they had this fear curbed by being told that the task was not about intelligence, it was about some other sort of ability that had nothing to do with cognitive skills. And what we saw was that there was a huge difference between the white and blacks whenever the stereotype threat was naturally looming in the air. But on the contrast, whenever their fear was diffused, we saw that there was great equitability between the whites and blacks and how they performed. Now, this has been shown in a lot of further examples with women, once again, in mathematical settings, black and white men playing golf, black men, whenever they were reminded that the test was about some sort of cognitive skill, and white men, whenever they were told it was about natural athletic ability, both of them declined. With the French, lower class tensions had a factor in how they performed on language, and also in several other examples. Over 300 essays and works have been published on the topic, showing that this is a very strong theme throughout not only just America, but the world as well. So you ask, what causes stereotype threat? And it's a very simple answer. The risk of confirming those negative stereotypes, me being in a room wanting to get the watermelon, but being afraid of how I'd be perceived and confirming a stereotype for going and getting the watermelon. So people feel threatened because they're not able to interact in maybe a way that they normally would, or they have a preoccupying limitation that causes them to act in a different way than maybe they naturally would. So, who is vulnerable to stereotype threat? And as I said before, everybody has a vast tapestry of social identities. And because this is true, everyone is affected. However, certain characteristics do lead to how we're affected, especially in terms of performance. First of all, we have to care about the task. A similar study was done by one of Steele's colleagues. And in that study, he went to an inner city school that he had formerly gone to, and he practically performed the same test between minority students and white students. But what he did instead was, this time, he made sure to ask the students if they cared about school. And it led to a very interesting phenomenon. Within the students who did not care about school, there really was no difference. But with the students who did care about school, there was a drastic disparity between the white students and the minority students. And usually the students who cared the most were the ones who were most greatly affected by the stereotype threat. And we see that from the outside looking in, it seems as though all the minorities really just don't care too much. Where in fact, the stereotype threat kind of levels out any sort of academic difference between the students who do care and the students who don't. Also, people must find frustration in the task. All studies were also done to show that students who had very easy work did not really get affected by stereotype threat. Whereas whenever they were frustrated, further ingrained into their head was the fear that they might end up confirming the stereotype. So because you take a test on any sort of subject that they are linked with, and within the test, they usually, at some point, either stress a certain identity or they don't. And with the students who have that stressed identity and have that effect more emphasized, they feel a greater threat by the stereotype. With Asian women, they even did an example in which when the Asian women's positive stereotype threat of being Asian was stressed in the test, they found that they performed better than they averagely would, and whenever their, and this is on a mathematics test, whenever their identity as being a woman was stressed, they performed worse than they normally would. So we see that it's not necessary for actually going on. Okay, and lastly, we see that you don't have to have prior susceptibility. Although this may be a factor, we see that it's not essential for the stereotype threat to permeate one's being at a certain time. They did this with certain groups who didn't even have associated identities or stereotypes that were attributed to them on a regular basis, but when they imposed it in a experiment, they saw that they had similar effects to those who actually did have the identities or the stereotypes imposed upon them. So within that situation, effects can be shown whenever we stress what may not have even been really stressed or shown before. So you ask, what continues this monster from moving in the background of our minds? First of all, it's internalization. This is when we continue to hammer ideas into our head. And when that happens, whenever we focus on a social identity or believe something is true, it does become more true because we feel the pressure is associated with it. And that leads to lower performance. Psychic damage, a focus on deficiencies. These are very similar, but internalization obviously deals with the internal, and psychic damage is more of a phenomenon that is stressed by outside forces. And lastly, and probably I think the strongest one that links with the rest, is the self-fulfilling prophecy. So whenever people are under stereotype threat, oftentimes they perform worse than they would otherwise. And what happens is that the stereotype threat is imposed because they're fearful of confirming the stereotype threat, or the stereotype. So when they do confirm it, they begin to think that it's true. And this continues to strengthen the pressures upon them. And when that happens, when that pressure is strengthened, then they perform even worse. And it's just a vicious cycle in which the stereotype threat becomes even greater and a stronger monster. So you ask, how would we reduce this threat upon our society, seeing that it has these profound impacts on how we can perform? First of all, self-affirmation. This is basically the idea that we continue to tell ourselves, it's like the opposite of negative self-internalization. Reframing the task. Once again, looking towards the example of African Americans at Stanford, whenever the task is not framed to fit the stereotype, then the stereotype threat cannot fit either. So in that situation, the effects that are often shown begin to vanish. De-emphasizing threatened identities. This is shown with the Asian women as well. Whenever we emphasize certain identities, that can change our perceptions and how we interact. Providing positive role models. This is basically another mechanism to show that the stereotype is not always true. And lastly, showing other effects to attribute difficulty. Especially with self-internalization, we begin to really think that the stereotype and the beliefs that come with them are the reason why we perform a certain way. And when we look to other factors, we begin to see otherwise. And lastly, we'll look towards consequences. Obviously, there's decreased performance. but especially with disengagement and this identification, this can have profound impacts. Looking towards what Shay said earlier about intelligence, and how it's very important, especially with groups that are negatively stereotyped in fields of academia. Many times, people who find frustration in these areas and see lower performance from stereotype threat are discouraged to continue working in those fields. So especially for maybe women in mathematics or African Americans in general academic settings, we may not, or those groups may not have the need to continue looking for those very important factors. Alter professional identities and aspirations. This can have very immense impacts on individuals in how and what they do with their lives. Once again, especially when they're discouraged from pursuing something, they can change what they do based on whether or not they have to deal with that certain type of threat. Low self-esteem and low motivation are also factors. A few months ago, whenever I was on Facebook, I was looking down my newsfeed and I saw someone's status. And I forget exactly what it was about, but I remember that it had to do with flashing lights at an airport and an African American male who was running from it. He was trying to make a humorous status, and although I did find it humorous, I thought it was unnecessary that he added in the part about an African American male. In all likeliness, I probably would have laughed no matter what type of person it was. If you're running from some sort of baggage cart with flashing lights in the airport, that's pretty funny regardless. But, so I commented on the status, and that's practically what I said. I said I would have laughed at that, anyway. Afterwards, some other student who I know commented and said, no, black people are known for committing crimes. That's why this is funny. So I found this very conflicting. I ended up giving about a very organized, I think, 3-point tirade explaining how ignorant that comment was. And he responded saying, calm down, it was just a joke. To me, this was not just a joke. To me, this idea that these jokes were innocent and didn't have any impacts obviously had been shown to be wrong. And as I've given you today, there are several reasons why stereotypes and jokes of that nature that we give to society, we perpetuate, that we have control of, can have profound impacts. And they're not so innocent in nature. So, whenever someone asks, how innocent is the innocent joke, I hope that this picture suffices. Thank you.